Willowshade is a cursed little village nestled in the misty countryside of Maine, 80 miles north of Portland near the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Its 4,600 residents live in colonial-era homes that form a crooked ring around a 17th-century chapel, as well as in old trailers perched along windswept cliffs. Willowshade's exact origins remain mysterious, and its history is soaked in eerie tales of floods, invasions, and monsters, both mythical and real. Every corner of its sordid past seems touched by the supernatural. The village takes its name from a local legend about a young woman, Lydia Willowshade, the daughter of a Puritan minister. According to the story, Lydia was executed during a witch trial in 1692, but was said to have risen from her grave to curse those who condemned her. In 1765, the town was devastated by a fiery storm that some claimed was caused by a malevolent sea spirit. And in 1837, a lynch mob targeted a family accused of harboring dark secrets, leaving behind a legacy of whispers and shadows. Fast forward to 2005, when 30-year-old sales executive Vanessa Campbell returned to Willowshade to view a house for sale. Number 13 Cedar Lane, also known as the Keep, had a dark past. Once a colonial jail, it had held women accused of witchcraft, including the infamous Agnes Blackwood, who was hanged for allegedly cursing the townsfolk. I remembered seeing the old sign outside, Campbell explained in a recent interview. I didn't feel scared. I grew up around this stuff. Vanessa, with her jet black hair and adventurous spirit, wasn't interested in the bland cookie-cutter apartments most people her age gravitated toward. She wanted something unique, something with a story. The Keep was just that. Though converted into a home in the early 1900s, the building still bore the marks of its grim history. Barred windows, thick stone walls, and iron rings bolted into the basement floor where prisoners had once been shackled. The property had been on the market for months, largely due to its reputation. Rumors abounded, tenants breaking leases, neighbors reporting unexplainable screams at night, and even a recent suicide by one of the previous owners. But to Vanessa, the $150,000 asking price seemed a bargain. I could picture myself living there, fixing it up, maybe even settling down eventually, she said. Having spent over a decade working in sales for luxury vacation properties, Vanessa had cultivated a sharp independence, yet her travels had insulated her from the folklore of her hometown. She was vaguely aware that the narrow alley behind the house was known as Coffin Row, so named for the bodies carried through it during the town's darkest days. She had also heard whispers about a skeleton unearthed near the old chapel, its limbs bound with iron to prevent it from returning to life. Still, these stories felt like quaint local trivia, not red flags. I grew up in an old house too, Vanessa explained. There were always weird noises. It never bothered me. She also admitted she knew little about Agnes Blackwood and the witch trials. To her, the Keep's ominous reputation was part of its charm. But soon after moving in, she began to regret her decision. What started as small, almost dismissible occurrences, books sliding off shelves, strange cold drafts, soon escalated into a full-blown nightmare. Vanessa claimed that objects would fly across the room with alarming force, and she began waking up with unexplained bruises and bite marks. Visitors reported seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the house, and one guest even claimed to have been shoved down the staircase. Within months, Willowshade Keep had become infamous, with paranormal investigators, journalists, and even local clergy trying to make sense of the malevolent presence. John Fraser, a prominent researcher, compared it to the notorious Amityville horror house in Long Island. This is not just a haunted house, Fraser stated. It's a vortex of something far darker. Unbeknownst to Vanessa, her dream home was becoming a waking nightmare, one she would soon realize had no easy escape. The shadows at 32 Elmwood Lane stood silent, cloaked in history and secrets. Ava Henderson couldn't wait to move in. On a brisk autumn afternoon in 2005, she and her best friend, Carla Monroe, lugged boxes up the groaning wooden stairs of their new home. The two had grown up in the coastal village of Graywick, Massachusetts, and couldn't have been more different. Ava was bold and headstrong, while Carla, recovering from a grueling battle with leukemia, was lighthearted and easygoing, a natural foil to Ava's intensity. Carla, who worked part-time at a nearby cafe, had heard all the chilling rumors about the shadows. I remember this one family who lived here, Carla said as she dropped a box on the dusty floor. Their son swore the house made him do things. He even set his room on fire more than once. People said he was possessed. Ava chuckled nervously, dismissing the stories as exaggerated village gossip. She set about unpacking, plugging in the kettle for a much-needed cup of tea. The shadows retained a rustic charm, its dark wooden beams crisscrossing the walls, whispering of its bygone days. While Carla carried another box inside, Ava was startled by the sound of footsteps behind her. Spinning around, she expected to see her friend, but instead she saw an ominous black mist lingering near the doorway. It dissipated before her eyes, leaving her frozen, her pulse racing. From the kitchen window, Ava watched Carla laughing outside as she struggled to carry a particularly heavy box. Ava swallowed her fear, determined not to alarm her friend. Later, Ava gave Carla a tour of the house. Downstairs, the remnants of its sinister past were unmistakable. A solid wooden door with iron bars, a chilling relic from its days as a colonial holding cell. In the soot-blackened fireplace, Ava discovered an ancient iron hook chained to the wall, a remnant of its days as a jail for criminals awaiting trial. As they cleaned, Ava stumbled upon a stack of yellowed papers in a forgotten corner of the kitchen. Among them was an unsettling discovery, a death certificate. "Oh my God," Ava muttered. "Look at this." Carla leaned over her shoulder to read the document. "This guy, George Hale, hung himself here," Ava said, her voice hushed. "And look at the date, October 27th, just days before Halloween." Carla grimaced. "Great. Just the vibe we need." Their cleaning unearthed more than just paperwork. Underneath an old rug, Ava found a squirming mass of maggots. She screamed, and Carla rushed over. Armed with bleach and determination, the pair scrubbed the floor clean, though the incident left them both unnerved. Other peculiarities quickly made themselves known. The house was perpetually cold, even on mild days. Odd drafts carried the scent of fresh-baked bread, acrid pipe smoke, and something sour that turned Ava's stomach. One morning, shortly after settling in, 3 loud knocks shattered the stillness of the house. When Ava opened the door, a boy stood on the porch. He couldn't have been older than 12, his hair spiked in messy tufts, his school uniform slightly askew. "I'm sorry to bother you," the boy stammered, "but it's tradition, you know?" "Excuse me?" Ava asked, confused. "My grandma, she's a white witch, says you have to knock 3 times when you pass this house. It's to show respect and keep the bad spirits away." He looked genuinely frightened. "Sorry again, I won't bother you." Without waiting for a reply, the boy bolted down the street, disappearing into the shadows of the narrow alleyway. Though odd, Ava found herself charmed by Greywick. Through her bedroom window, she often spotted deer grazing in the nearby meadow. Nights in the village were eerily still, with only the occasional flicker of candlelight breaking the blackness. But Ava's fascination couldn't erase the house's dark history. The shadows had endured centuries of strife, and its walls seemed to hum with restless energy. Carla brushed it off, chalking everything up to overactive imaginations. But Ava couldn't shake the unease that prickled her skin whenever she passed the staircase or lingered in the kitchen. On one particularly quiet evening, Ava found herself flipping through an old book she had uncovered during their cleaning spree. It detailed the history of the area, including a woman named Marjorie Kemp, a midwife from the late 1600s accused of witchcraft. She had lived and died in Greywick, her reputation tarnished by whispers of curses and dark rituals. Ava's finger hovered over a passage. Marjorie Kemp was accused of placing curses that brought harm to her neighbors. Her accusers claimed she spoke incantations to heal, but her cures often came at a price. The uneasy connection between Marjorie Kemp and the shadows felt like a thread pulling tighter, binding Ava to a past she didn't fully understand. She snapped the book shut, trying to ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. If the rumors were true, the Shadows was more than just a house. It was a crossroads, a place where history, tragedy, and the supernatural converged. The vicar's visit to the cage was intended to bring peace to Vanessa Mitchell and Nicole Kirtley. Reverend Martin Flowerdew arrived on a brisk November morning, his demeanor calm yet curious. He carried a small wooden cross and a leather-bound prayer book. As he stepped inside, his expression changed subtly, as though the air in the cage bore a weight invisible to the naked eye. "This place has a history," he said softly. glancing at the wooden beams and the ominous cage door. Flowerdew began to pray, moving from room to room. He sprinkled holy water, pausing in places where he claimed to feel an oppressive energy. But the atmosphere didn't improve. That night, after Flowerdew's visit, Mitchell and Kirtley both awoke to the sound of heavy breathing in their respective rooms. Mitchell, never one to back down from a confrontation, shouted, "Who's there?" No response, just the slow, deliberate sound of something exhaling in the darkness. The strange occurrences escalated. One evening, while Freddie Young was visiting, he stopped mid-conversation, his face draining of color. "What's wrong?" Mitchell asked. Freddie pointed toward the fireplace, his voice barely a whisper. "There's someone standing there." Mitchell spun around but saw nothing. Kirtley, however, swore she caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure retreating into the corner. The boy, shaken, refused to stay any longer and ran home to his grandmother. Desperate for answers, Mitchell decided to dig deeper into the cage's history. She spent hours poring over old records at the local library and speaking with villagers who had their own chilling tales about the house. One elderly woman recounted a story about a tenant in the 1970s who had fled in the middle of the night after seeing a woman in black sitting at the foot of his bed. "I've lived in this village my whole life," the woman said, "and no one stays in that house for long. You do well to leave it." But leaving wasn't an option. Mitchell had sunk her savings into the property, and Kirtley, recovering from cancer, had nowhere else to go. As winter set in, the disturbances became physical. One night, while washing dishes, Mitchell felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Kirtley, too, began to experience unexplained bruises on her arms and legs, as though someone had grabbed her in her sleep. "I can't take this anymore," Kirtley sobbed one evening. "This house, it's alive. It doesn't want us here." Mitchell tried to reassure her friend, but deep down she was terrified. She began sleeping with the lights on, but even that provided little comfort. Then came the night that broke her resolve. Around 3 a.m., Mitchell was jolted awake by a loud bang. She rushed downstairs to find the kitchen in disarray. Plates and glasses were shattered on the floor, and the chain by the fireplace swung violently as if an unseen force were yanking it. And then she heard it, a voice, faint and chilling, whispering her name. "Vanessa." She froze, her heart pounding. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Vanessa." Grabbing her phone, she called Kirtley, who was upstairs. "Nicole, are you okay? Did you hear that?" But there was no answer. Panicking, Mitchell raced upstairs, only to find Kirtley huddled in a corner of her room, her face pale and tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's her," Kirtley whispered. "The witch. She's here." The two women fled the house that night, seeking refuge at the King's Arms. As they sat in the dim-lit pub, surrounded by the comforting hum of locals, Mitchell made a decision. "We have to find out what she wants," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "This isn't just a haunting. It's a warning, and if we don't figure it out, it's going to destroy us." With the help of Freddie's grandmother, a local historian, and a paranormal investigator from Essex, Mitchell and Kirtley embarked on a quest to uncover the cage's darkest secrets. But the deeper they delved, the more they realized that the cage wasn't just haunted by the spirits of its tragic past. It was a portal, and something far more sinister was trying to break through. Vanessa Mitchell's departure from the cage did not mark the end of its haunting legacy. In fact, her leaving seemed to intensify the house's sinister grip on those who dared cross its threshold. Determined to turn her misfortune into an opportunity, Mitchell attempted to rent the cage to a friend from the village. However, her plans unraveled almost immediately. The prospective tenant, wary of the cage's dark reputation, hired a psychic to cleanse the property before moving in. The psychic, upon entering the courtyard, abruptly refused to proceed, her face pale with unease. "There is something here that does not want to leave," she murmured before hastily retreating. That friend backed out of the arrangement. Mitchell's next tenants, a young couple with an infant, managed to endure only 2 months before fleeing without explanation. The revolving door of renters continued, with no one lasting long enough to establish even a semblance of normalcy. Desperate for help, Mitchell reached out to the local church, only to discover that the vicar, Reverend Flowerdew, had abruptly transferred to a parish over 200 miles away. The official reason was stress, though rumors swirled about an incident involving a block of concrete smashing through his car windshield. In a candid interview with a local newspaper, Flowerdew admitted to suffering a nervous breakdown, an event he attributed to the relentless pressure of something unseen but oppressive lingering in St. Osyth. As financial pressures mounted, Mitchell decided to confront the cage's infamous reputation head-on. In 2010, she contacted the Society for Psychical Research, SPR, a venerable organization dedicated to investigating paranormal phenomena. John Fraser, a leading member of SPR's Spontaneous Cases Committee, visited the cage and conducted an extensive series of interviews with Mitchell, her friends, and former residents. Fraser found the testimonies compelling, drawing parallels between the cage and notorious poltergeist cases like Amityville, with one key difference. The cage stands out because the accounts come from multiple credible witnesses, Fraser noted. Among them were professionals like Liz Williams, a cancer nurse, and Claire Young, now a school teacher, whose calm demeanor lent weight to their unsettling recollections. Fraser's investigations also revealed disturbing physical effects experienced by visitors. A female investigator reported angry red marks appearing on her legs after an overnight vigil, which were later diagnosed as burn-like blisters by a medical professional. Kim Sondergaard, a Danish paranormal researcher, described being overcome by an intense wave of sadness while standing in the courtyard. "I broke down and cried uncontrollably," he recounted in a recorded testimony, adding that he left with unexplained bruises on his arms. The cage's reputation soon attracted amateur ghost hunters from across England. Equipped with Ouija boards, spirit boxes, and night vision cameras, they descended on the property, eager to document the supernatural. Sensing a commercial opportunity, Mitchell began renting the cage for ghost hunts, charging visitors £35 per night. The British tabloids quickly took notice, dubbing it Britain's most haunted house. Sensational headlines followed. One article claimed a retired police officer had photographed spectral figures in Coffin Alley, while another featured images of witch-like faces and a supposed satanic goat. Yet not everyone was convinced. Documentary filmmaker Colin Werland dismissed the supernatural claims as exaggerated. "She's made quite a bit of money out of this," he remarked skeptically. "It's hard to separate fact from fiction." Werland's doubts deepened after consulting archaeologist Jacqueline McKinley, who examined the supposed skeleton of Ursula Kemp, unearthed years earlier in St. Osyth. McKinley's findings were unequivocal. The remains were not of a female witch, but of a man, and the iron spikes accompanying the bones were recent embellishments intended to fuel the legend. Further revelations came from Paul Brooker, the grandson of Charles Brooker, who had initially discovered the skeleton. In a candid confession to the Clacton and Frinton Gazette, Paul admitted, "Granddad added the nails to make it more dramatic." In 2012, the bones were reburied in unconsecrated ground during a solemn ceremony attended by both pagan and Christian representatives. Despite this symbolic gesture, the cage's dark aura persisted. Unexplained phenomena continued to plague the property. The King's Arms pub, a local gathering spot, saw its regular patrons dwindle to none, leading to its eventual closure. Then, in 2016, an inexplicable car accident on Colchester Road brought the cage back into the spotlight. The driver of a BMW swerved off course, crashing directly into the building. Shaken but unharmed, he claimed to have no recollection of what caused him to lose control. To Mitchell, it was yet another sign that the cage's malevolence extended beyond its walls. By the end of the decade, Mitchell's financial woes forced her to sell the property. She listed it with a realtor who leaned into the house's infamous history, staging it with broomsticks and books about witchcraft. In January 2020, she finally accepted an offer of £224,000. Though the sale brought some relief, Mitchell's profits were eroded by years of mounting debts, legal fees, and property taxes. The new owner, a divorcee hoping for a fresh start, brushed aside Mitchell's warnings about the cage's cursed history. "She doesn't believe in ghosts at all," Mitchell remarked, a note of both pity and relief in her voice. For her, the sale marked the end of an ordeal that had defined more than a decade of her life, though she doubted the cage's restless spirits would ever truly be at peace. Vanessa Mitchell had finally made up her mind. She could no longer endure the torment of the cage. Every moment spent in the haunted house was a test of her sanity and survival. By summer 2008, she had resolved to leave for good, but the spirits within the cage seemed unwilling to let her go so easily. On her last night in the cage, Vanessa returned to the empty house to gather the final boxes of her belongings. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than ever, as though the house itself resented her departure. The old beams creaked under the weight of an unnatural stillness, and the faint scent of burnt wood wafted through the air, a cruel reminder of the fire that had once consumed the home of Charles Brooker, the man who had profited from the skeleton's grim legacy. As Vanessa stepped into the prison room, she was overcome by an oppressive chill. The dim light from her torch danced on the stone walls, casting eerie shadows. She hurriedly packed the last few items into a box, her every movement punctuated by the feeling of unseen eyes boring into her. Suddenly, the room darkened further, as though a heavy shadow had passed over her. "Leave," a deep voice whispered behind her. Vanessa froze, too terrified to turn around. The whisper grew louder, now a chorus of voices overlapping, all commanding the same thing: "Leave." Her pulse racing, Vanessa grabbed the box and bolted from the room. She didn't stop until she was outside, the box clutched tightly in her trembling arms. But as she loaded the box into the van, she glanced back at the cage and saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, a woman dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothes, her hollow eyes fixed on Vanessa with a look of unrelenting malice. The move to her friend's house brought no immediate relief. Vanessa found herself haunted not by the spirits of the cage, but by vivid nightmares and a lingering sense of dread. On one particularly stormy night, she awoke to a violent pounding on the bedroom door. For a moment, she thought she was back in the cage. But when she opened the door, there was no one there, only the sound of wind howling through the trees outside. Determined to rid herself of the cage's grip, Vanessa sought help from local mediums and paranormal investigators. One medium, an elderly woman named Agnes, visited the house and confirmed Vanessa's worst fears. "This place is a portal," Agnes declared after walking through the cage. "The spirits here are restless because they were never given peace. You're lucky to have left when you did." Agnes advised Vanessa to hold a cleansing ritual to sever her connection to the house. Desperate for closure, Vanessa followed the instructions, burning sage and reciting prayers late into the night. Though the ritual brought her a measure of comfort, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits of the cage would always be a part of her. Months later, Vanessa returned to the cage one last time, this time with a television crew for a paranormal documentary. She hoped that by sharing her story, she might finally achieve some closure. As the crew set up their equipment, strange phenomena began almost immediately. Cameras malfunctioned, lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty rooms. During an interview in the prison room, Vanessa recounted her most terrifying experiences. As she spoke, the camera operator suddenly gasped and pointed to the corner of the room. Everyone turned to see a dark shadow moving along the wall, only to vanish a moment later. The crew hurried to pack up their gear, unwilling to linger any longer than necessary. Years later, Vanessa would reflect on her time in the cage with a mix of fear and disbelief. The house remained unsold for a long time, its sinister reputation scaring off potential buyers. Eventually, it was purchased by a paranormal enthusiast who embraced its haunted history, turning it into a site for ghost tours and investigations. For Vanessa, however, the cage was a chapter she wished to close forever. She focused on raising her son and rebuilding her life, though she never forgot the harrowing experiences that had pushed her to the brink. "The cage took a piece of me," she would later say in interviews, "but it also made me stronger. I survived what most people would never believe, and that's something no ghost can ever take away." The divorcee who purchased the cage, Eleanor Hart, was a pragmatic woman in her early 50s. A seasoned professional in corporate finance, she viewed the tales surrounding the cage as nothing more than provincial folklore. She envisioned transforming the property into a peaceful retreat for herself and a lucrative rental space for tourists eager to visit a village steeped in history. "Every old house has its quirks," she remarked during a brief interview with a local paper. What matters is turning a profit, not pandering to ghost stories. Eleanor's confidence seemed unshakable as she moved into the cage in late December. She spent the first few weeks overseeing renovations, determined to modernize the interior while retaining its historical charm. Contractors came and went, each with their own peculiar stories. A carpenter claimed his tools vanished only to reappear hours later in a completely different room. A painter swore he heard whispers when he worked alone. Eleanor dismissed the incidents as tricks of the mind. The first night Eleanor stayed in the cage, she felt an overwhelming chill despite the central heating running at full capacity. She wrapped herself in a blanket and poured a glass of wine, telling herself it was just an old house settling into its new chapter. But as the hours dragged on, the chill turned into an oppressive weight. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. Eleanor's sleep that night was restless. Her dreams were vivid and unsettling, filled with shadowy figures and the faint sound of chains dragging across stone. She woke up at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of a baby crying, a sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She searched the house, her heart pounding, but found nothing. The next morning, Eleanor chalked it up to exhaustion and refused to entertain any notions of the supernatural. But over the following weeks, the disturbances escalated. Lights flickered without explanation. Doors slammed shut on their own. Eleanor began to feel a distinct presence in the house, particularly in the room she had designated as her home office. One evening, as she worked late on her laptop, the screen flickered and went black. When it powered back on, the words "Get out" were scrawled across a blank document. Eleanor stared at the screen, frozen, before slamming the laptop shut. Her skepticism began to waver after she invited a friend, Paula, to stay for the weekend. Paula was an amateur paranormal enthusiast who had long been fascinated by the stories surrounding the cage. Armed with a spirit box and a digital recorder, Paula conducted an impromptu investigation. The results were chilling. The spirit box emitted disjointed voices, including one that clearly whispered, "Help me." When Paula played back the recordings, both women heard a deep, guttural growl that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Despite these experiences, Eleanor refused to leave. She was determined to confront whatever force lingered in the cage. She began researching the history of the property in greater depth, uncovering stories that hadn't been widely reported. One account spoke of a midwife in the 1600s who was accused of witchcraft after a newborn in her care mysteriously died. Another told of a soldier from the English Civil War who was imprisoned in the cage and later executed, his ghost rumored to haunt the property seeking justice. Eleanor enlisted the help of a renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. Evelyn Carter, whose methods were both scientific and empathetic. Dr. Carter arrived with a small team equipped with thermal cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and audio recorders. Over the course of 3 nights, the team documented an array of phenomena: sudden temperature drops, unexplained orbs of light, and disembodied voices calling Eleanor's name. Dr. Carter concluded that the cage was a nexus of residual and intelligent hauntings. "The energy here is undeniable," she told Eleanor. "Whatever lingers in this house is deeply tied to its history of suffering and injustice." Eleanor faced a choice: sell the cage once again, knowing the stigma would make it nearly impossible to find another buyer, or remain and attempt to coexist with the unseen forces. She chose the latter. In the months that followed, Eleanor adapted to life in the cage. She established boundaries with whatever entities resided there, speaking aloud to announce her presence and requesting peace. Remarkably, the disturbances lessened, though they never completely disappeared. Visitors to the cage continue to report strange occurrences, but Eleanor has grown accustomed to the house's eccentricities. "It's not a haunted house," she often says. "It's a house with a history, and like any history, it demands respect." Whether the cage's story ends with Eleanor remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the echoes of its past are far from silent.